Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was assassinated by a group of knights in his cathedral in the year 1170. We told his story in last week's episode of Assassins, including how his martyrdom turned his place of death into one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe. Soon, the word spread that this dead martyr could heal the sick, and so the Catholic Church made him a saint. Thousands of people trekked over long distances to benefit from his powers after death. But Thomas Becket's murder didn't just produce a saint, he created a world of art and objects that tell his story, and the story of how medieval people understood his assassination. Mary McGillivray is an art historian who makes some great TikToks under the handle The Iconoclast. I can verify her content is great because I've been following her since COVID. Mary, welcome to Assassins.
Hi Aslan, how are you? It's great to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Mary, what does it actually mean when we say Becket's shrine was one of the most popular in medieval Europe? Now, who was coming and where were they travelling from?
So the shrine to Thomas Becket, which was inside Canterbury Cathedral, was one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in medieval Christendom. In some sources say even after Rome, it was the second most popular place for Christians to visit to worship and to hopefully get a little taste of a Thomas Becket miracle.
Were most of these pilgrims doing the entire journey, or were people joining somewhere along a shorter path?
Yeah, so Canterbury sits kind of at the nexus of many crossroads in medieval pilgrimage routes because it's on the way to Dover, connecting where England connected to France. So it would have been very accessible for people not only moving through the UK, through England to get to Canterbury, but also for people coming through France. But today, the kind of remaining pilgrimage routes, the main ones would be the Pilgrim's Way from Winchester, which is almost 200 kilometres away from Canterbury, and the main road from London, which was, of course, a very popular route. And the route from London takes about a week. You can do that in a week. And the route from Winchester is about 2 weeks.
So even though the shrine was around for roughly 300 years, we're not certain what it looked like, right? Why is that?
That's right. We actually sadly don't know exactly what the shrine to Thomas Becket looked like because it was destroyed in 1538 by King Henry VIII. In a very tumultuous moment in English history known as the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, there's a couple of reasons that it was destroyed in this moment by Henry VIII. One was that it was considered to be a symbol of the power of the church. And Henry VIII, of course, was a king who was trying to dissolve the power of the Catholic Church in England. And the other reason is that the shrine, as we understand it from remaining descriptions, the shrine itself was incredibly valuable materially because it was covered in so much precious gems and gold and silver that melting it down, taking all these gems away, would have been a huge boost to Henry VIII's coffers.
Well, then what did pilgrims see when they arrived there? What exactly, was there a variety of art pieces? Were there sculptures around? What exactly was the site?
Yeah, so the site of the shrine is in what's known as the Trinity Chapel in Canterbury Cathedral. It's not the exact place where Thomas Becket was assassinated. It's sort of around the corner. The structure of the shrine in the Trinity Chapel, from what we know from descriptions and some images that have survived, was quite a complex and layered structure. At the centre were the relics of Thomas Becket, and that's his bones, essentially. His bones in a casket, a box, and this casket was said to be wood bound in iron, so probably strapped together with iron. And then that box was inside another wooden box, which was said to be covered in jewels, gems, pearls, rubies, sapphires, and beautiful gold inlay. So an immensely sort of glimmering and shining object. That box, which was quite large, like probably almost the size of a coffin, was covered in a canopy. There would have been amazing, beautiful, bright-coloured marble floor all around it. perhaps steps leading up to it where people could approach the shrine and pray. It would have been a very materially overwhelming experience for the pilgrims who visited, because it would have been one of the most, opulent things that they would ever have seen in their lives.
Wow, okay. So there's clearly a lot of Becket-related objects around here, paintings, sculptures. Do you reckon these help spread the story of his death, almost like a medieval news service?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good way of putting it. There's so much material culture from the Middle Ages that we don't think about. We think about the big cathedrals, we think about the big monuments, but then there's so much detail and so many smaller objects as well that really cobbled together created a visual language that told the story of Thomas Becket's murder and his martyrdom. Really, there's things in everything from stained glass windows in Canterbury Cathedral and in other places, and wall paintings in churches which told this story, right down to small personal objects like pilgrim badges and brooches. This iconography, usually what we see is some knights, usually with a sword, beheading what looks like a monk, or perhaps someone dressed as a bishop, which of course Thomas Becket was. So these very simple figures, even in a very simple pose, sword, knights, and monk, came to stand in for the story of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket.
Right. Well, you mentioned stained glass windows. Now, Canterbury Cathedral had stained glass windows showing Becket's murder and, miracles. Were these particularly important for people who couldn't read at the time? Well, education wasn't particularly widespread, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to the almost truism that stained glass windows and wall paintings as well were a way of communicating narrative stories to an illiterate public. People in the Middle Ages weren't all as illiterate as we might assume, but a lot of the illustrations that we see in churches were sequential. You start with one part of the story, then you see the next scene, then you see the next scene. And often they would have also needed someone to vocally tell the story alongside the illustrations to fully complete that narrative. So they would have prompted not only perhaps priests to tell stories, or sort of medieval equivalents of tour guides to tell the stories, but also prompted the memory of the story that you'd heard in your parish church back home, the story of Thomas Becket. You turn up in Canterbury on pilgrimage and you see the key moments of that story played out again on the walls or in the windows for you to see again.
Right. Well, you mentioned a lot of these images were quite graphic, quite violent. Now, I'm wondering how medieval people, when making this pilgrimage, would have understood those images.
I think a lot of medieval art to our modern eyes does look pretty gory. But one thing that we have to remember is that there's a function here for images that show the martyrdom of saints in particular, which often tend to be the most gory ones. Thomas Becket's isn't even, a beheading isn't even the most gory of saints' martyrdoms that were popular in medieval iconography. There's several others. St. Bartholomew is flayed alive and skinned. There's some pretty gross ones out there. But the purpose of these quite, graphic images is to really evoke the pain and suffering and the extremity of the story of these people's lives, the lengths to which they would suffer in the name of their religion, essentially. And so there's a sense of eliciting sympathy and reverence, and also, in the same way that the crucifix is seen all throughout religious art in this period, there's a sense of meditation. You should look at these images and meditate on the suffering of this person.
Now, from what I recall, pilgrims would bring home souvenirs. Now, what sort of stuff are we talking about here? What do these objects mean to these people?
Yeah, so in the same way that when we go on holiday today, we feel the need to take photos to prove that we were there and perhaps to buy things to prove that we went to this place. It was exactly the same for medieval pilgrims. These people might have taken weeks or maybe months or maybe years out of their regular lives to embark on a pilgrimage. And the whole point of a pilgrimage in this period is to physically go to a place where there are relics and to have an experience physically. So it's no wonder then that people wanted to have a piece of that spiritual experience. Now, souvenirs for pilgrims could be all manner of things. There's sort of three main categories, though. The first category is something called a primary relic. A primary relic is, again, we're going to get gory here, literally a piece of the saint's or venerated person's body, a piece of bone, perhaps something purporting to be their blood. So things that are physically part of the body. Now, these were very expensive and very rare for obvious reasons. And of course, a lot of enterprising souvenir makers would have made up that they had bones of certain saints or parts of bones of certain saints. But the second type of relic that was more achievable for average pilgrims would have been the secondary relic, which is something that has touched the body of the saint. So a piece of a clothing item that they wore when they were alive, for example. And again, you can imagine how many tiny pieces of cloth have been said to be holy relics in this sense. And then you have, again, the third layer of pilgrim souvenirs, which is the tertiary relic. And this is things that have touched the saint. So we're getting quite abstracted here.
Okay. Right,
and these
awesome.
Things would have, either touched things like there's lots of medieval sites would run oil over holy relics and then have, that oil put in little vials, or you would get a little badge and touch the badge to the oil. So there's a lot of layers of removal, but the important part is that you had something that had been in a place, touched a certain thing physically. Now, if we're talking about pilgrim badges in particular were small items that you would pin to your clothing, like a badge today. They were often made of things like pewter. Some of the really expensive ones were made of gold, and then the really cheap ones were made of like paper mache, essentially. And these would be images of perhaps the site that you went to or of the saint that you were venerating. And these are some of the only pieces of evidence that we have, visual pieces of evidence of what the shrine to Thomas Becket looked like in the Middle Ages before it was destroyed by Henry VIII, because some of these badges are little kind of cartoon versions of the site itself. It's kind of like getting a fridge magnet for the Arc de Triomphe or the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You take a little version home with you.
So going back to the shrine of Thomas Becket, after Henry VIII destroyed everything, where did the actual shrine end up?
And that is the million-dollar question, because it likely was broken up into many different pieces and the individual gemstones and gold would have gone to different places. There's unsatisfyingly few pieces that we can confidently confirm were part of the shrine originally. There's stories that Henry VIII had an enormous ruby that was part of the shrine, made into a ring that he wore on his thumb. We don't know if that's true, though. And then additionally, the bones of St. Thomas were distributed and moved sort of all around the world and are not entirely traceable. But in 2016, remarkably, a bone that was said to be part of his elbow had made its way all the way to Hungary sometime since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, and was returned to Canterbury to much fanfare as sort of a homecoming for what is believed to be part of Thomas Becket's body.
Well, back to when Henry actually destroyed the shrine, how did the pilgrims and worshippers react when the shrine was destroyed? Do we have any understanding about whether there was anger, protest, or violence?
Strangely, there wasn't a very strong outcry against the destruction of this shrine that we have seen, that we know from the primary sources from that moment in history. Now, this, though, is likely because of fear of the climate of what was happening in Henry VIII's reign with the dissolution of the monasteries. There was a lot of fear about what Henry's government would do, backlash. So at the time of its destruction, there isn't a lot of outcry. However, since that moment, there have been several waves of Thomas Becket sort of revivalism through history, and he's come to mean different things to different people since then. And I would say that today we have an interesting sort of new revivalism of the sort of pilgrimage and pilgrim culture of that medieval moment, because the current new Archbishop of Canterbury actually completed her own pilgrimage from London to Canterbury in March this year. She's the first Archbishop to do this in quite a long time. Her name's Sarah Mullally. She's the first woman to be Archbishop of Canterbury and head of the English Church. And I feel like perhaps there's something in there about the enduring meaning of the story of Thomas Becket and the pilgrim culture of the Middle Ages that might be having a little moment this year.
Well, Mary, that takes us to the end of our interview. Thank you so much for your time. I know I've learned a lot.
Thank you.